so excited to see people that have legs, because usually I see them on Zoom squares. This is our first real event that we've had, even though we don't really open until Monday. So welcome. Our last event here was March 8th of 2020, and it's been a really long time. Since then, we have been working and we've built a museum from home online, and we have redone all of our galleries. This one and the Apple Tree Project, which you all get to see, the reason why you're here today, and our anthropology and our bio lounge is downstairs. Are there any students here today? Yay. The CU Bio Lounge, which is right underneath us, again, it opens on Monday at 9 a.m., is always voted one of the best places to study on campus. It's free, we're open every day, and in a non-COVID semester, we're serving free coffee, so just bear with us until we can do that again. Nobody comes to this museum to listen to me, so I would like to introduce Dr. Catherine Suding, aka Katie, who can tell you about today's program and speaker.
Thanks, Sam. So super excited to see everyone in person, and it's so great that we are able to get together and open the Natural History Museum. So I just want to say that I think we have surpassed 900 tagged trees today. So several trees that we're really excited to go after in terms of who they are and their cultivar, and we're honing in on a group of about 20 or 24 trees that look like they're specific cultivars or just Boulder. And so that's going to be really exciting this next year. So just to say, we have a exhibit opening, so if you can kind of take a look there. It gives a lot of the results from the 2018 Blitz and what kind of apple trees we found there as a start. And then the interactive map, we've been working with amazing CU computer science students, and so the stuff that you have tagged today is going to be able to go almost immediately up onto the map, and so you can see what we found today, but also what we've been finding over the last many years on that interactive maps. Just make sure to take a look at it and explore, right? Explore virtually there. So I wanna also, just before we start, have just a really huge thanks to Amy Dunbar Wallace, who she's the glue, and none of this would ever happen without her. So thanks, hats off, Amy.
Thank you.
Super important to this project. The other group I really want to thank is the 1250 students who were the leads in the data collection today, and just your professionalism and your knowledge about how to run the protocol and how to collect the data that we really need was just amazing. So thanks, everyone. So one thing about me that some of you might know, some of you might not, is that I grew up in a household with, my dad was a geologist, and so super science, and I would go out to the field with him and study rocks however I could. But my mom is an artist, and so I grew up in a mixed household where there was both art discussion and science discussion, and I always thought it was interesting to think about how it reflected on how I approach the things that are really interesting to me and what I'm passionate about. And I feel like this project is a really good example of how all these different aspects of how we view the world and how we have our knowledge about the world kind of intersect. And so I'm really excited to introduce Sam Van Aken. So Sam is an artist, a professor at Syracuse University, incredibly well known for his sculpture works with living mostly trees, fruit trees. One of his most well-known works is called The Tree of 40 Fruits. Will you be talking about it today?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so this is one tree that has branches and produces 40 different stone fruits. So almonds, peaches, plums. I can't even name 40. I'm like maybe up to 4. So, but so just amazing. And so really is intersecting this natural world with the biology and with the art. And so with that, thank you so much, Sam.
Thank you so much for inviting me here, Amy, Katie, Lisa, and is it the 1250 class? All right, the 1250 class, you guys are great because, I mean, for those of you that came back to see me talk again, you should get an award or something. So, Sahara is my team leader. So when this starts to go bad, I want you to go like this. Okay, so I have been working with fruit trees for about 15 years, and I think I've become obsessed with heirloom fruit varieties for about the past 8 years. My obsession really comes, probably I think from a unique angle in terms of, in addition to looking at these as biological specimens, as food, as nutrition, as something that holds genetic material, I'm interested in them as cultural objects. Every single one of these heirloom varieties has an embedded history and story with them, and it tells the story of migration. So looking at these as cultural objects akin to artworks that should be preserved, I thought I would give you a little bit of background on me and kind of my artwork leading up to it that would give you an idea of how I got this way. So I grew up on a dairy farm in Pennsylvania, which in a lot of ways was the 19th century. We grew all of our own food. My mom made my clothes until I was in junior high. There was a swimsuit accident with the community pool that stopped that. But in other ways, we were really feeling the effects of industrialization. Corn companies used to pay us to plant their seeds out, and we didn't know it at the time, but those were actually some of the first transgenic corns. And we milked almost 200 cows morning and night. So I was very eager to find the thing that was farthest from farming, which led me to art school. And art school, my art education was very unique. This is my college ceramics professor who had these insane trips that he would schedule. So he asked us all one spring break, what are you doing for spring break? Would you like to go to Europe? And there were a whole bunch of volunteers, and you end up driving ambulances during the war in Bosnia. The amazing thing that he did was he established exchanges with other schools in Eastern Europe. And so right after I graduated, I got to go to Poland and work with dissident artists. So these dissident artists were artists that were considered unofficial by the communist government, and therefore if they made art, they would be thrown in jail or lose their passport, or these Stalinistic tactics where they wouldn't fire you, but they'd fire their entire family from their jobs. So since they didn't have access to traditional art materials, they started using things that were around them, right? And the interesting thing for me was that by transforming the everyday object, you create the potential and possibility for change. And so in my early artworks, I started to do that. So I work with what's around me, and at the time it was internet culture was really starting to develop, and I started working with one of the first memes on the internet. So inside this 16-inch heating duct is a 9-inch surveillance monitor, and on the monitor is a video of a zookeeper sweeping an elephant's pen, and the zookeeper slips and hits the elephant in the back of the knee, and like a human, the elephant sits down onto the man's head. And I was just shocked because in addition to being on the internet for the first time, this was also on all of those reality TV shows like those typical reality TV shows you would see. And so as a way to kind of turn the way in which we see the piece, I made it so that everybody has to put their head inside of the vent. And I thought, okay, this is going to be like an empathy machine, that people would be empathetic towards that zookeeper. But in the end, it was terrible because people would just go watch the video, tell their friend to do it, and then laugh at them, and it kind of ruined my whole idea on human nature. And I was like, I'm not doing any more empathy machines. So other projects that I was working on, I became, the phrase, oh my God, I became really fascinated with, because in that one single phrase is so many emotions, right? And how a single phrase can be interpreted in so many ways. So I built a 50-foot long by 8-foot tall wall and sampled phrases of people saying, oh my God, at that time for television programs. You can see it at an angle here. It was all constructed on a steel frame. And there were 600 clips of people saying, oh my God, that were on this computer. Then I built an algorithm that randomly selected from the database and then randomly sent it out to the 500 speakers that composed the wall. And the algorithm also built up to a crescendo. So what would happen is it would start with like a oh my God and a oh my God from here and there. And then by the time it reached the 6.5 minute mark, like it is just screaming, oh my God, there's like a coffee, right? And it just stops and there's a reverberation that takes place throughout the room. And so like with a lot of these pieces, I became really interested in that, in terms of them being sculpture, I was interested in that, they call it kinesthetic, right? So it's an aesthetic experience that's more than just visual. At the same time, I kept going back to the idea of grafting. So my great-grandfather made a living grafting fruit trees. And so the interesting thing is that even though I grew up in an agricultural community, people revered him. Like I always think of farmers as people that are incredibly resourceful, right? You don't necessarily have the resources to pay somebody to fix it for you, so you learn how to do it on your own. The thing is with grafting is it's such a refined skill set that I never met my great-grandfather, but anytime somebody would speak of him, they would mention he knew how to graft, as if it was like this mystical or mystical capability. So I started coming back to grafting as a metaphor, right? I was thinking of it in terms of speaking to kind of hybridity, right? How, like, not only our food, but even our existence, right? We spend so much time engaged in a physical and virtual world. So I started, I had these pieces of plastic fruit in my studio, and I started to cut and put them together, and then exhibiting them on these things that were reference helixes, and then you can't graft pieces of plastic fruit together without it having some very, sexual connotations. And so that was that project. I eventually, after, anything worth doing is worth doing like 500 times. So after 500 of these, I eventually thought, well, I need to make this real. So what I wanted to do is, I tested all the compatibility that exists between garden vegetables and created this exhibition called Eden, right? This rethinking of the garden, where I would graft together vegetables, right? And they would all grow from like one root structure. It's kind of crazy to think that like over 70 to 80% of tomatoes are now grafted, right? They're commercial varieties. So it's something that's practiced pretty commonly, and testing the compatibility that existed between each of these varieties as I grew these gardens, I realized what it could do. It actually helped me in a later project, which I told the people in the 1250 class we'll talk about at the end after we're done. So, and here are just some images. The problem with this artwork is that it dies. That was sort of like, artists that like to look for things that have longevity. This project was gone by October because all the vegetable plants eventually died. Other grafting projects I was doing were these projects where I would have orchids in two different planters and then graft them together in a sort of competition to see which one would take over the other's root system. was thinking of these orchids and those sort of, that phenomenon of grafting as being metaphorical. So at about that same time in my regular artwork, I became really interested in the idea of narrative, and I was invited to go to Germany for an artist residency, and I discovered the author Karl May. Karl May is the best-selling German author of all time, if you take away the Bible. And he wrote these westerns based on these two characters, Shatterhand and Old Winnetou. And the interesting thing is that he wrote these stories without ever actually visiting the American West, right? And it's interesting because in German culture, people still take 6 weeks out of their summer to go to these Karl May camps, and they dress up as cowboys and Native Americans. And that's what they do for 6 weeks, and then they go back to their everyday life. It's interesting because Mai actually traveled to the US to visit and only made it as far as Buffalo, and the reality of it was too startling for him, and he travels back to Germany. So for my residency, I was like thinking in this idea of like a Western carried out on the wrong landscape, so I decided to stage a Western in Berlin. And these were all sites that were were film locations, and then were also had a historical reference. For anybody that reads philosophy, this is Walter Benjamin Platz, and it's also the place where Matt Damon ran through in one of the Bourne Identities. And so I can tell you about getting a pony delivered to the German Reichstag. I will say that. So I rode a pony around the German House of Parliament, and it was interesting because a photographer came up to me and said, "Can I take your photograph?" And I really didn't think twice about it. And the next morning, I woke up and I started to get emails from all over the world. It started, like I got emails from Japan, then I got emails from Australia, kind of made it around the globe to California. And the photographer was actually from Reuters news agency. And I guess Reuters sells canned stories, and so it shows up in all of these regional newspapers. And I was thinking, wow, if I exhibited my artwork in a gallery, and I have a pretty good gallery in New York, maybe 3,000 people are going to see it, and this one particular work went out to millions of people. And it made me start thinking about, it was another reason why I started to think about how artwork could take place outside of a gallery or museum setting. Which leads to the War of the Worlds. I was driving to New York City and I came across this small town in New Jersey, and it happened to be the setting of the War of the Worlds broadcast, right? And I thought it was a fictitious town. I don't know how many of you are familiar, but the War of the Worlds broadcast was in 1938, and it was by Orson Welles, and it was a staged radio hoax. And you have to, it's kind of hard to conceptualize, but think about radio as the only form of media at the time. Wells does this stage production saying that aliens landed in a town named Grover's Mills, New Jersey. It caused mass hysteria. People started like fleeing. Supposedly the aliens were attacking the National Guard. And I always thought that that town was fictitious until I'm driving through and I found Mr. Grover's house, who was supposedly the owner. And in Mr. Grover's backyard was a standpipe, so it was an old water source for the house, that during the night of the broadcast, the good townsfolk of Grover's Mills got their shotguns and started hunting for aliens. And on the night of the broadcast, they mistook that standpipe for an alien ship and blew all these holes in it, right? And I was thinking about how, this is like really Don Quixote, right? Where like the reality of a thing changed just through narrative. So I talked to the homeowner. I was able to get the tower. which I then turned into a radio tower and did my own radio production. And so the thing I thought that was really interesting with this tower is it started as a windmill, becomes a standpipe. On the night of the War of the Worlds hoax, it becomes an alien ship, and then I turned it into a radio tower, right? And hoaxes are not a good art form either. Mostly because this exhibition, we staged our own radio hoax and played it in Buffalo, which was also another site of a War of the Worlds broadcast, and it got shut down before the exhibition even opened. So, but I like that idea of a hoax, so I looked into what a hoax is. And hoax comes from hocus pocus, which in turn comes from a line in the Catholic Eucharist. It's hoc est anum corpus meum, where the priest says, "This is my body," over the bread. And to Catholics, he literally transforms the bread into the body of Christ, right? And so, and I mean, that idea of transubstantiation, I was thinking, how could I make an artwork that functions like that? So I developed this idea for the tree of 40 fruit, right? The tree of 40 fruit is a single tree that grows 40 different types of stone fruit. That's peaches, plums, apricots, nectarines, cherries, almonds, all in one tree. Throughout the majority of the year, it's a normal-looking fruit tree until spring, when it starts to blossom in all of these different colors of pink and white. And then in summer, starts to produce a multitude of different fruit. The process for creating a variety, for creating these trees, is pretty simple. What I'll do is I grow the trees. I'll show you some images in a minute. I grow the trees out until they have 3 or 4 scaffolding branches, at which point I'll use a whip graft on the very end of the branch. And then after that, I'll use a bud graft, sometimes 1, sometimes 2 bud grafts below that initial graft. And I can turn one branch into 3 different varieties within one season. So the problem with the project, skip that, is that when I started, I couldn't find 40 different varieties of stone fruit. And this is despite the fact that I live in New York State, which is, up to about 50 years ago, it was the second leading producer of plums. It was in the top 10 of growing within peaches. It was a leader in growing apricots. And that it largely disappeared as the state has gradually shifted to growing apples, in essentially a monoculture. So I was able to find one of the last research orchards in the East Coast. What's happened in New York has happened throughout the eastern seaboard, where as certain states become known for growing particular foods, the ag experiment stations start to, they become focused on one particular variety. So they are, that's where the money's at, and that's where they follow. So I was able to take, there were 300 varieties of stone fruit from this orchard and graft them onto my trees. And I was, at the time when I was doing this, I was growing out of a space that was maybe 1,500 square feet. And so what I would do is how I do this process is I'll go out and I'll take clippings in January and I store them in plastic bags with a damp cloth at the bottom, seal them up and store them at 38 degrees until usually about the 3rd, 4th week in March, at which point I'll take out the scion, those are the branches I've collected, and start them on new root structures. To create the tree of 40 fruit, what I'll do is I'll grow for 3 or 4 years, at which point, by the time the tree is 3 to 4 foot tall, I'll head it off, right? And by heading off, that means that I'm cutting the central leader, or the trunk, out of the tree, so that it starts to develop a vase shape, right? If you let an apple tree go, it's pretty much going to grow straight up, right? So by doing this, it controls where essentially the nutrients are going within the tree. And so this is what the tree of 40 fruit look like when they're first planted, and this is what they look like about 5 years later as they start to blossom. So here's the details of the blossoms. And so each of the trees has a diagram to it. What I'll do often is, with stone fruit, you have a great diversity in the times in which they blossom. So what I've been able to do is I've created records of all of these different stone fruits, their blossoming time in relationship to each other, so that what I can do is I can essentially sculpt how a tree blossoms in spring. Not only in its color, right, so there's pinks and whites, sometimes even crimsons, but then also how it blossoms, right? So I can have certain areas that'll go off first and then get filled in later. The other thing that I have to do is that although stone fruit are pretty much compatible, there are some incompatibilities between them. For instance, you can't graft cherry trees directly to plum trees. You have to use an interstock variety. And so it took me years to track all of those varieties down. And so now what I do is I use a Spanish variety of plum known as Adara. It's also known as Puente or Bridge, that goes between the plum and the cherry variety. So you graft in that interstock, and then by the end of the season even, you can start to graft in cherries on top of it. And so these are what the trees look like as they start to come into fruit. And so as the project evolved, what I would start to do is that as I would be asked to create these, this is at the Everson Museum in Syracuse, as I would be asked to create them, what I would do is I would research varieties that have been historically grown within the region. I would source those varieties from local growers or from the USDA and graft them onto the tree so that the tree itself became an agricultural history of the region and then also preserve those varieties. So, and this is what they look like. These particular trees grow like weeds. So they'll grow. It's not uncommon for these to grow like 10 feet in a growing season, so I'm constantly pruning them back. And so here are some of the sites that I'm doing nationally. I also have probably like 3 or 4 projects going internationally right now. So this all kind of happened by 2014, and I had started to actually work on new work. I became really interested. About 2011, they shifted our USDA grow zone in Syracuse, New York. We actually increased like almost a full grow zone, right? Which has radically changed fruit growing. And then even then, we were starting to experience some of the inconsistencies with weather. And for us, what that's meant is that, like you have here, right, where you have apple trees that fire off, in an early blossom in April, and then there's successive freezes that kill off the blossoming. So I thought, my mom told me the story about my grandfather who owned the farm where he was a very stoic person. I think he said like 5 words to me from like birth till I was 12. But she told me about this one time when we were experiencing a drought, and she said she had never seen him express emotions except during this drought where she saw him one night like kneeling by his bed, like crying, praying for rain. And I was thinking about how like when we've exhausted all technologies, that's when we start to resort to the metaphysical, right? To those things that exist like just beyond technology and also science. So I started doing projects like this. I went to Bar Harbor, Maine, and I collected the air of Eden. So actually Bar Harbor, Maine was once known as Eden, so I compressed, it was like 60,000 cubic feet of air, moved it in bottles westward to fill up these weather balloons in the museum. This is what it looks like from the second floor where it starts to emulate a cloud, and then over the course of the exhibition, the air deflates and then the whole exhibition disappears. It's sort of like changing the atmosphere of the museum. And then another project I started working on is putting holes in clouds. So these punch hole clouds, or Fall Street holes, started to become popular on the internet maybe about 10 years ago. And people, they suspected that they were either Russians or aliens, and I was like, I think it's probably different than that. So I started looking into it, and I found out that they were occurring about 30 to 50 miles away from airports. And they were also occurring during altocumulus clouds, which occur 6 to 12 hours before a change in weather. And then I started to learn how to read these UT diagrams. Like around the world, there's something like 14,000 weather balloons that are sent up twice a day. And they have these small little radio sondes which record humidity, temperature, as they go through the air. And that's what all weather forecasts are based on, which totally fascinating. I got a pilot in Rome, New York, and so whenever it looks like we're going to get those altocumulus clouds, we were jumping in the plane, flying around Syracuse, and putting holes in clouds. Which this might be my best project ever, because after a while I didn't have to do it anymore. I developed a way to do it with actually weather balloons that put sea salt into clouds, and it does the same thing. But the great part about the project is I didn't have to do it, because now people will like go around and they'll see these punch hole clouds, and then they send me documentation and they're like, hey, were you in New York City today putting holes in clouds? And I'm like, yeah. They're like, were you in Ireland? I'm like, yeah, I was there too. Traverse City, Michigan. So an interesting thing happened in about 2014 is that this rendering of the tree of 40 fruit became a meme. And so this is a marriage counselor in Indianapolis. Used this on their website. There's also a really great one with this hippie that is like prefers tree of 40 fruit over GMO. And it was like crazy, because like I started to get a lot of interest from like press sources and that sort of thing. I got interviewed on NPR's Morning Edition, and the thing I didn't think about was that if you are on NPR, everybody in the government listens to NPR. So I was on NPR on a Saturday. By Monday, this organization was contacting me. So DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Project Administration. They're the ones that invented the internet, robot cars, etc., etc. They asked me to come to Washington and speak to them about fruit trees. And I was like, you want me to what? So, and I thought it was like a big scam, and I was actually a little nervous. I was like, this has to be about this weather project that I've been doing. So I go and, in the process of talking to them and a few other sources, I found that I had one of the largest collection of stone fruit in the eastern United States, which was terrifying, right? That an artist was kind of like the person that was holding this collection. And at that point, I became obsessed with preserving them. I had lost 6 or 7 varieties that I was told that no longer existed, right? And I was like, I was still pretty young in my growing capability, so I was like, how am I going to preserve these? I had the blood cling, a couple strains of blood cling peach. Blood cling is called that because the flesh is red inside. It was originally introduced by the Spanish in the early 16th century, cultivated by Native Americans for 200 years, until it's rediscovered by the English of Virginia. They take it back to Europe, thinking that peaches are native to the American continent, and then they find out that it's actually called sanguinol, or blood in French. So it's a French variety that was grown by the Spanish, that goes to Florida, that gets cultivated and makes this, sort of international journey. Other varieties where France has a long history of developing apricot varieties. So Royal, Gros Péché, large early Longameth were all varieties that I had, that I was attempting to both learn and preserve at the same time. And then Agen, which was believed to have developed during the Crusades, that it was plum seed brought back by Christian crusaders, grown in a French monastery during the Dark Ages when pretty much agriculture was pretty limited, and then it becomes the basis for all of the prune plums that are now grown in the United States. And so the other way that in addition to keeping them going, I thought of as an artist, here's how I can preserve these varieties. So I started doing it through exhibitions. So I would go into old orchards as they were being torn out, and I would cut out the trunk section, or the bowl, and it's, in here you can see it contained the original graft knot. Other things I started to do is by creating my own pressings. I got a 19th century book press, which was really cool. And then those eventually evolved into voucher specimens, and I started to develop my own herbarium. See? And this is an exhibition called Seeds of Resistance at Michigan State University. From there, I started creating cyanotypes, similar to Atkins, who made the first, botanicals. I would preserve trees as they either perish or for museum display. It gets even stranger because then I start to get into Chinese rituals where these are eclipse peaches. So the ritual says that if you collect the branches of peaches during an eclipse, you soak them in salt water until the next full moon, and you hang them from a red string, they become a wand, right? And because that is what a peach branch is actually called. It's called a peach wand. So, and supposedly it's it brings you good luck. So if you hang it over the door. Other things that I was doing is collecting all the peach seeds I was harvesting. It's interesting that early prayer beads were actually made from peach seeds. This is from, it's so weird. I thought the World Economic Forum was something that they only made fun of on 30 Rock, but it's actually a thing, and I got invited, and so I turned the whole thing into a grafting workshop, and this is me being, what I was doing is I created these cross sections of grafting knots, and I got the chance to teach Will.i.am how to graft trees, and then I taught, this was like, I almost fell over, but that's Peter Gabriel, how to graft trees, and he's like, oh yeah, I'll have to have you over to my island in Sardinia to work on my olive trees. And I was like, of course, Peter Gabriel, you do have an island and trees. I started creating botanical specimens of each of the varieties, which eventually led to making copper plate etchings. And how you do that is you cover a piece of copper with asphalt, and you scratch through that layer of asphalt, you etch them, and then you can make prints from them. So I got to a particular point, I made the Napoleon. This is the Peche, or Peche de Nancy. I got to a point that I was like, these are just botanical prints. I don't know why that would, after I do it 50 times. So what I started to do is make these botanical prints that are almost like palimpsest by layering all of the botanicals that were ever done by the species. And to me, it becomes about this, almost like this obsessive kind of documentation that I've been trying to do and capture for all of these fruit varieties. But in all of that, the thing that I realized is that no matter how I render it, no matter how I describe it, I cannot share that taste with people, right? And so people aren't going to be able to experience it on that level. And so I came across this idea of Strauchswiese. So Strauchswiese are famous in Europe. They're meadow gardens. So what would happen outside of small European villages, the city would communally plant the orchard. Then they would all graze their cattle underneath the trees. And then they would all share in the fruit. And I thought, I need to create a Strauchswiese. So that led to the project known as the Open Orchard. So I was shopping around this idea for a public orchard for about 4 or 5 years, and I was looking for an acre of land in New York City, and people would laugh at me. It was almost like they were patting me on the head going, you're so funny. Until I ran into amazing people at Governor's Island, and they said, we're going to give you a home for this orchard. And so if you look at this area right here, by the end of next month, that will all be planted out with 100 multi-grafted fruit trees. And those fruit trees bring back all of the fruit that is native to, originating, or historically grown in New York. So the odd thing with New York is that New York is the home of fruit growing in the country, right? So varieties like the Green Newton Pippin, the first cosmopolitan or international apple from there. The Streaked Pippin, which was believed to have disappeared, was recently rediscovered in Washington. So it comes from Queens, New York. Varieties like the Fall Pippin and Vanderveer, all originated in New York. George IV peach, which became one of the first international peaches, developed on Broad Street, which is like it intersects with Wall Street, right? It was this chance seedling that is grown all around the world and then disappears all except for 3 trees, which have been gradually brought back. Heath Cling, the parent to probably most of the peaches that we now grow. And then the Washington Gage plum. Gage plums were grown as fresh eating varieties before Japanese plums were introduced. So, in markets, fresh eating plums were always known as Gages. In addition to these, it also brings back the Prunus maritima, or beach plum. So Henry Hudson, Verrazano, all of the early explorers of New York Harbor note that how the beach plum was growing on the shores, and that that Native Americans would clear away all of the other competing plants from around them so that they became, so that they were essentially cultivated. And then this is the first grafted tree, or documented grafted tree, planted in New York City. This is the Stuyvesant pear. It was a summer Buncratine pear, or summer good Christian, that was planted by Governor Stuyvesant roughly 1640. The tree lasted for 222 years at the corner of 13th Street and 3rd Avenue until a beer truck crashed into it, right? But fruit growing, actually cultivated fruit growing, so grafting fruit trees, was actually developed in New York with the establishment of nurseries in Flushing, Queens. Huguenots escaping France after they revoked the Edict of Nantes all relocated in Flushing, and they brought intensive agricultural practices with them, including grafting. So this is the plot for how the trees are going to be laid out. There's 102 actually. 50 of them are going to be apples because apples have the longest life. And in between them are going to be stone fruit varieties. Part of the orchard is that I'm also doing workshops looking back at pre-modern ways of growing and grafting and caring for and using all of these fruit. One of the ideas is that if you go, like that is the original organic garden. I read, this is weird, but I spend nights reading 19th century agricultural reports. And over and over you hear industrial fertilizer. And what industrial fertilizer at the time was is they were taking byproducts of ocean fishing and using that to fertilize all of their fields. So I do workshops on planning. Some of those are online through New York City Work, New York City Parks, fresh eating tours. I've started to do terrible cooking shows. Like if you want to watch something really funny and terrible, then watch the cooking shows. So the way that I've come to think about the orchard is like by going back to those old fruit. Like I don't have any problem with genetic modification. Right? I actually support the American Chestnut Project, which is attempting to bring back the chestnut tree, which once made 30% of our forest back east. The thing I have a problem with is that why are we genetically modifying when we don't know what we had, right? And I think that's what really, for me, going back to these old fruit, old ways of growing, it kind of gives us a chance to rethink and to re-envision of what we might want. So the open orchard is designed with the Lene Lenape philosophy of trees, where no one can own a tree, but only the fruits of their labor. And that's my philosophy of orchard. The other thing that I always close on is that I am absolutely an amateur, and I absolutely love that. Back in the early 1900s, as the land-grant universities encouraged farmers and growers to cut down on the number of varieties they were growing, amateur orchardists are the ones that kept all of the diversity that we now have alive, right? And I like to think of myself as an amateur because the root word of amateur is love, right? It's a norm. And it's doing something because you love it. So that's... Oh, I have one more thing. Okay, so I told people what else I was working on. Okay, so these are the trials. I was talking to the 1250 class. So one of the things that I'm doing is using grafting with the potential to grow vegetables in the desert, right? So one of the ways that we're looking at doing it is using Nicotiana and Petunia as a base plant. And then right now we've done all these trials on interfamily grafting. And it turns out that Nicotiana is the best that we have as a universal interstock that could be grafted between, like, you know, a vegetable plant and whatever the host plant is. So here are some of the other trials. I'm working with a company called Grah Green in Japan. This is what we've got so far. And the hope, I'm really interested in it because I want to grow an entire cornucopia from one root structure, like these old Dutch paintings. But the real world application is that we'll be able to grow fruit trees in climates that aren't suitable for it. And so we're now looking at, you know, different types of fruit trees, but then also looking at palm trees, which can tie into deep aquifers that'll be able to give nutrients and then also water to the plant. So that's what I work on. Sorry. Okay. Thank you. Oh, that's a rendering? That is not made up. That is like, there's this Japanese designer that did that, and I was like, Jesus, that's beautiful. Okay, questions?
Nice work, man.
Thank you. Yeah.
So you showed that in your exhibit with the two planters that had all vegetables. So in each planter, were they all from this grafted on the same rootstock? Every single one of those?
Not every single one of them, no, because that was like a first iteration of the project. So essentially, at that point, although I had done trials with everything, I was pretty much staying within families. Eventually, the best I ever got to was the nightshades I found have the best compatibility and obviously incredible diversity. So the gardens I was creating were pretty much all nightshade plants or nightshades, and yeah.
That's really awesome because that was kind of early on in your grafting work, and you did that with all these vegetables like fruits, of course, those families became.
Yeah.
Can you name some of the ones that you grafted from that vegetable project? I mean, from the planters.
I mean, it turns out, I mean, Nicotiana, it's something with the cellular structure that we're still looking into. So the one of the project leads was at UC Davis, and he kind of found out about it by doing research on Benthamiana, right? It's a model plant, so he was doing research on it for another project, and has like found out like it's shocking how many vegetables you can actually graft to it, right? And then produce food. Like, I'm talking probably 75% of what's in your garden right now. So,
I
yeah.
wish you could see my mouth is just like open on amazement.
But we missed the potato-tomato thing. I was doing that like before, and then it became like a thing. And I was
It's a
like,
thing, yes.
another missed chance to be a millionaire. Yeah.
You mentioned kind of trying to revitalize different cultures been touched on the indigenous communities and like how they used to grow certain varieties of food?
Yeah. So I'm working with the Lenni Lenape, whose original lands extended from Delaware up to about halfway up the Hudson River, and we're working on an exhibition for the fall where I'm just growing out trees so that they can show them as part of their culture. And then also the other thing with the orchard is that in addition to the 100 trees that are planted on the island, 100 trees are going to go out to community gardens and historical sites where the trees once originated, right? So I'm trying to, placing the Newtown Pippin apple back in Flushing, Queens. And then the native beach plum, American plum, American crab, black cherry, throat cherry are all going to be at the Lenape Center. But yeah, it's important to me to do that, make that culture.
Awesome. Have you seen any effects of changes in the pollinator populations due to bringing these trees back to the native?
Changes in
Like the populations of the pollinators, like you see like increases in pollinators or maybe some pollinators coming back to urban areas?
not enough to be able to comment on it. Although I will say Brooklyn is the place of fads, and I think every other person now is a beekeeper, so that's helping. Right? That's definitely helping. I'm like, you're a beekeeper too. So, yeah.
I guess I have two questions. One is a follow-up to how do you establish your partnership with the Lenni Lenape people? And my other question as an artist, I work around actually working on a project around aesthetics of apple fruits. And how do you I think in terms of modern production, it's a lot of production is based around the aesthetic of the fruit and pesticides. And so I just was kind of curious if you're interested in working around the aesthetics of the fruit themselves.
Yeah.
And how people perceive them.
To me, the best tasting apples are the russets. There is something, I don't know if it's something within the chemistry of the skin or if it's just a texture issue, but my God, I don't know if you've ever had an Ashmead's kernel apple, but that thing is phenomenal, right? It's even golden russet's a great apple. So I think it's more just convincing people that it's not bad if you find a worm in your apple, it's only bad if you find half a worm, right? It's getting people accustomed to this idea, and I think a lot of it is just familiarizing them with agriculture, right? So many of us have become so, I'd say I spent as much time away from agriculture as I did engaged in it. And when you're that far away from it, your appreciation level is really low. You grow a tomato, you'll eat that thing no matter how ugly it is. So I don't know, to me, there's a whole other aspect of just doing that. And then in terms of the Lenni Lenape, I just offered them trees. I said, I'm working on this project, and I'm from the research that I've found, I know that the Lenape were cultivating these varieties to some extent, and would you like them? I'm happy to plant them wherever you want. And that sort of kicked off a conversation. And also, I recognize, so Governor's Island was once known as Paganut, or Nut Island. And so, yeah, just recognizing that in that sort of history with them. So, yeah.
Sam, do you just talk a little bit about why you're here?
Yes.
What you're going to do here? Yeah.
Okay, so I'm working here as a result between a collaboration between the Boulder Apple Tree Project, which I didn't talk about how amazing this is. I don't know any organization that's like this, to be honest, that is going out and seeking heirloom and antique fruit varieties. This is something really special, and I know that I personally I was honored to take part in it. So I'm working with the Apple Tree Project. I'm also working with the Boulder Museum of Contemporary Art and then Longmont Museum. And so what we're doing is we've created 5 of these multi-grafted, we're going to be creating 5 of these multi-grafted apple trees over the next year for an exhibition called Hearing the Call that'll be at BMOCA in spring of 2023. So the goal is to have all of these trees in blossom at that point. And the beautiful part about it is I gotta keep coming back to Boulder.
That tree is going to be on campus, one of the sites.
By the art school.
I was just wondering if you've ever had a chance to go to Asia and see where the origin of the stone fruit trees.
I did. I got to go to Beijing, and it was amazing. So everybody thinks that the donut peach is actually a relatively new invention. They were actually growing those at Prince Nurseries back in 1771, right? And then I went to look for, I had to go for schoolwork, but I tied in like a trip to, so 50% of American peaches should have their ancestry to one particular peach seed that was sent from China to England to A.J. Downing in New York and then sent down to Georgia. And the peach is called Chinese cling. And some of the more famous peaches came out of that: Alberta, Belle of Georgia, Carmen, and their DNA is within 50% of commercial peach varieties. And so I went to the orchards where they were supposedly, that originally came from. But the thing that I found that was amazing is the culture that was built around fruit, right? So you get, like the airport in Beijing is really far from the city, but you get into a car and you start driving in, and the whole highway is lined with peach trees. Like, it's insane. I was like, I have arrived. Like, and then you get, this is how the culture is. It's extraordinary. So they build hotels around orchards for peak blossoming season, right? So people will, and they book decades in advance, right? So that you are actually watching the peach blossom, which is something, it's definitely on a higher plane than being a tourist. Yeah. So, but there's so much more I want to see. There's like I want to trace like Asian plum varieties back to Japan. Yeah, I could spend the rest of my life doing it.
So you're going to be coming back in March, around the grafting time, and we do grafting workshops with the community at that time. I'm wondering if you have any specific techniques that are fading from the community that you might recommend that we look into to maybe, that we could maybe expand our offering for grafting workshops. We typically do that class grafting.
This is hilarious. So I started making my own grafting sealant, and I was like, because I got like 4 different recipes that date back to the 19th century, and they're actually all so much better than, like putting asphalt on a tree, right? And a lot of it is beeswax, rosin, but then the difficult thing to find is lamb's tallow, which you're like, where the F do you find that? Highly recommend you don't do it in your house. Like, it was like a pine salt explosion in my house that I couldn't get out for months. But I think like those types of things with, I can bring I've been collecting historical grafting knives and stuff. I think those are pretty interesting. Let me think about it, but we could definitely add some things to it.
Thanks so much.